But what if I told you this criminal empire, at its peak, larger than the entire Japanese army, was nothing like the Mafia you think you know? These are gangsters who held press conferences, criminals who cooperated with the police, outcasts who saw themselves not as thugs, but as honorable defenders of a forgotten tradition. How did one of the world's most powerful and enigmatic criminal organizations rise from the ashes of feudal Japan to control the country's politics and economy? And why, after centuries of power, are they now on the verge of extinction? To find the answers, we have to go back to the beginning. This is the real story of the Yakuza. As always, before diving into the full story, please consider hitting the like button to support ADB Crime Case. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified about our latest investigations. Now, let's begin. The Yakuza are one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations, as enigmatic as they are terrifying. Despite their long and complex history, many people associate them with tattoos and amputated fingers. This is what American authorities discovered when they first encountered these criminals in the late 1960s in Honolulu, Hawaii's capital. There, U.S. federal authorities saw the emergence of a new type of criminal, distinguished by tattoos and, in some cases, amputated fingers. They had no idea of the internal workings of this well-organized gang or how it ran its operations. All they knew was that this new mafia was immense, both in the size of its operations and the number of people it employed. It was unheard of at that time, and it didn't take long for American authorities to become concerned. For context, in the 1960s, the various American mafia organizations had around 20,000 members, whereas Japan had over 180,000 Yakuza, an impressive figure, especially for a country with a population half the size. Consequently, the United States soon raised an alert. They were confronted with a true criminal power that oversaw a wide range of activities, including gambling, drug trafficking, weapon sales, and even human trafficking. You're undoubtedly wondering what the U.S. government did to fight this criminal organization. They tried to obtain information about the Yakuza from Japanese authorities, but the Japanese were reluctant to share any information. You might think old post-war grudges were the reason, but the actual cause was much more straightforward and completely different. In reality, the Yakuza and the Japanese police have a long history of cooperation. Unlike the American Mafia, the Yakuza were accepted in society, and many family heads had strong ties to the police. Some Yakuza gangs didn't hesitate to display their union's emblem on their front door. It sounds crazy, as if the American Mafia were to mark its hideouts with signs that said, "Mafia Headquarters." Believe it or not, there's more. After specific shootings or gang conflicts, some Yakuza even held press conferences to announce the death of a civilian who was injured during the conflict, or to declare the end of a rivalry. As you can see, the Yakuza are different from other gangsters. So let's take a look back at the history of this organization, which was originally secret and is now well recognized. The origin of the Yakuza is quite uncertain, with no historical consensus on the topic. In reality, there are 4 opposing theories about the birth of the Yakuza, tracing back to the end of feudal Japan between the 17th and 19th centuries. 1. The Kabuki-mono. The first theory points to the Kabuki-mono, a term that can be roughly translated as the crazy ones. Their origin is mysterious, but they are said to be descendants of the Ronin, masterless samurai, from the feudal period. The kabukimono were known for their eccentric clothing and hairstyles, and were considered thugs, bandits, and outcasts whom no one wanted to associate with. Always armed with a blade or a katana, they terrorized defenseless citizens by committing crimes. It is said that the cruelest among them would kill innocent people just to test a new fighting technique or to check if their weapon was sharp. Their gangs were made up of eccentric samurai warriors in the service of the shogun, the Japanese military leader, and they possessed an unwavering loyalty that set them apart from other criminal groups. They protected each other and formed a true clan. There is a high probability that the Yakuza are the true heirs of the kabukimono. 2. The Machiako. However, most Yakuza do not claim descent from the kabukimono. Instead, they consider themselves successors to the Machiako, or servants of the town. In their own narrative, the Yakuza describe themselves as enemies of the kabukimono, the bloodthirsty samurai who, in feudal times, extorted, robbed, and killed honest people. By claiming to be Machiako, they position themselves as defenders of the oppressed and protectors of the people. However, establishing a direct link between the Yakuza and the Machiako is difficult. 3. The Bakuto. The third hypothesis points to the Bakuto, who were itinerant gamblers that organized gambling parties in the clandestine bars of feudal Japan. Some claim that the origin of the word Yakuza comes from this group. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, the Bakuto began using this word, which referred to the worst possible score in the Japanese card game Oicho Kabu. The game's principle is simple. 3 cards are dealt to each player, their values are added up, and the goal is to get a score as close to 9 as possible. The worst hand is a combination summing to 20, which is obtained by drawing the cards 8, 9, and 3, pronounced in Japanese as ya, kyu, and za, a version of san. The expression Yakuza came to mean something useless, and it was eventually used to refer to the gamblers themselves, especially the losers. 4. The Tekiya. The fourth theory involves the Tekiya, who were itinerant merchants and swindlers organized into guilds. They extorted money from inhabitants and travelers who had the misfortune of getting too close. The Tekiya were known for their strict hierarchy, which closely resembles that of the modern Yakuza. During the Japanese feudal period, the Yakuza began to organize themselves into families, similar to the Italian Mafia, with a godfather at the top, and members gradually integrated into the clan. What differentiates them from the Mafia, however, is the unique relationship structure known as the Oyabun-Kobun, which is intrinsically linked to Japanese culture. The Oyabun is the parent, or chief, and the Kobun is the child, or protege. The system works as follows. The Oyabun gives advice, offers protection, and provides help, and in return, receives the loyalty and unfailing support of his Kobun. In 18th century Japanese society, the Oyabun-Kobun system was the basis for relationships between teachers and apprentices, lords and vassals, and, in the growing underworld, between a boss and his right-hand man. In early Yakuza gangs, this relationship was sometimes characterized by a fanatical devotion of the Kobun to his Oyabun. This is unlike American criminal groups, where smaller bosses don't hesitate to backstab their superiors to dethrone them. The Kobun's devotion was such that he was expected to stand on the front lines against cannons and swords to keep his boss alive, even at the risk of his own death. If the Oyabun committed a crime, the Kobun also had to suffer the penalty and go to prison in his place. While things have changed today, the adage is still popular among the Yakuza. If the boss says that a passing crow is white, you must agree. For a humble Kobun, climbing the Yakuza ranks could be a daunting task. He was usually given menial tasks like polishing dice, cleaning the Oyabun's house, running errands, or even babysitting. While the origin of the Yakuza remains uncertain, one verifiable fact literally sticks to their skin: the tattoo. You are probably wondering why this practice was and is so widespread among Japanese gangsters. To answer this, we must look at its origin. At one time, tattooing was a punishment used by Japanese authorities to ostracize outlaws from society. For each crime committed, a black ring was tattooed around the thug's arm, making it possible to distinguish criminals from honest people at a glance. However, there is a nobler tradition of tattooing. Its remarkable patterns, considered by many to be the most beautiful in the world, date back hundreds of years. Over the years, the patterns became increasingly intricate, blending a striking array of famous gods, folk heroes, animals, and flowers. By the end of the 17th century, the complex full-body tattoo became popular, especially with the bakuto, gamblers. The traditional tattooing process was long and particularly painful, as the ink was inserted under the skin using non-powered handheld tools. A full back tattoo, from neck to coccyx, could take almost 100 hours to complete. This complexity and painful application made it unique. These tattoos became popular with the Yakuza, who saw these indelible symbols as a way to differentiate themselves and prove their belonging. The tattoo was also perceived as a test of strength, which demonstrated their courage, toughness, and virility. The tattoo had another, more metaphorical purpose. The self-inflicted wound represented an inability to adapt to society. It was a visual way for the Yakuza to express their marginality. Today, many Yakuza use more modern tattooing techniques, although some continue to get tattoos in the ancestral way, earning them greater respect within the Japanese underworld. As a side note, the tattoo is now so closely associated with the Yakuza that Japanese saunas and public baths often hang signs that say, "Forbidden to people with tattoos," to protect their customers. If the Yakuza are recognized by their tattoos, they are also known for a much more striking practice: the amputation of fingers. To understand this, we must first look at the rules that govern the Yakuza and the initiation ceremony for new members. An official ceremony between the Oyabun and Kobun takes place on an auspicious day, with all members of the organization in attendance. Rice, fish, and salt are deposited in the alcove of a Shinto shrine, in front of which the Oyabun and Kobun are seated face to face. Intermediaries ceremonially serve the fish and fill glasses with sake, which symbolizes a blood bond. They then solemnly turn to the Kobun and warn him of his future duties. After drinking from the cup of the Oyabun, and he from yours, you must now be faithful to your family and devote yourself to your Oyabun, even if your wife and children starve. Even at the cost of your life, your duty is now to the family and the Oyabun. In addition to this initiation rite, the Takiya and Bakuto developed a code of honor, inspired by the Japanese code of chivalry, which demanded secrecy and the strictest obedience to the Oyabun Kobun system. Until recently, the Yakuza were required to respect this code, which stated, "Do not harm innocent citizens. Do not steal a friend's wife. Do not steal from the clan. Do not take drugs. Respect and obey the clan leader. Be prepared to sacrifice life and liberty for the leader. Do not discuss clan secrets with anyone. Do not reveal the organization's secrets to the police. Do not kill civilians." If a Kobun had the misfortune of breaking any of these rules, he could be severely punished. Cowardice, disobedience, and divulging secrets were seen not only as acts of treason, but also as affronts to the clan's reputation and honor. Besides death, the heaviest penalty was expulsion from the ranks. When a member was banished, the Oyabun would notify other clans that the member was no longer welcome, ensuring the outcast could not join any other gang. For serious offenses that deserved neither death nor expulsion, there was yubitsume, a custom introduced by the Bakuto that involved ceremonially cutting off the upper joint of the little finger. The primary purpose of this amputation was to weaken the victim's hand so that he could no longer grip his sword firmly. This practice made the Kobun even more dependent on his Oyabun's protection. As an act of repentance, the severed phalanx was wrapped in a thin cloth and solemnly handed over to the Oyabun, who would usually accept it. If the offense was repeated, another amputation could be performed on the second joint of the same finger or the upper joint of another finger. Yubitsume was usually a warning before the member's final expulsion. The Bakuto and Takiya were also known for their very close relationship with the police. They were the first Japanese criminals capable of cooperating with authorities, a cooperation that enabled them to consolidate and extend their influence. This marked the beginning of a political corruption that would extend to the highest echelons of the Japanese government. Under the reign of Emperor Meiji starting in 1868, Japan achieved its first economic miracle, breaking the last ties of feudalism and rapidly transforming into an industrial power. This economic prosperity allowed the Yakuza to expand their activities even further. At the end of the 19th century, some Yakuza organizations began to pay bribes to the police, a habit that would persist for a very long time. In this new, more industrial Japan, the Yakuza had to modernize, and to do that, they needed to get involved in politics. This was not as difficult as it might seem, since gangsters and politicians had one thing in common: their deep attachment to conservatism and nationalism. A man who perfectly symbolized this union was Mitsuru Toyama, an ultra-nationalist who idolized the samurai tradition from an early age. He entered politics in his early 20s by participating in one of the last samurai uprisings against the Meiji government, a failed coup that earned him a 3-year prison sentence. Toyama hated everything the Meiji era represented: economic and cultural modernization. Upon his release, he joined the first nationalist group and began to gather supporters, some of whom were Yakuza. Toyama used this tough fighting force to limit social conflicts and assassinate certain left-wing politicians. He quickly gained a national folk hero image like Robin Hood, earning the approval of both the people and a segment of the Japanese political sphere. His political convictions would change the history of the country and the Yakuza when he created the Genyosha, Dark Ocean Society, in 1881. This nationalist federation was a precursor to secret societies and patriotic groups that brought together many former Takiya and Bakuto. From then on, ultranationalism became a component of the Japanese political landscape, a landscape in which the Yakuza now fit perfectly, thanks to their alliance with politicians. In the early 20th century, many Yakuza gangs emerged, including one in the city of Kobe, the Yamaguchi-gumi, currently the largest Yakuza family. By the early 1930s, this syndicate succeeded in ousting all its rivals and rising to the top of the Japanese underworld. The Yamaguchi-gumi owes its rise mainly to its leader, Kazuo Tauka, the undisputed godfather of Japanese organized crime, known for his cruelty and his organizational skills. In the 1930s and 40s, he transformed the Yamaguchi-gumi into a powerful criminal organization with nearly 13,000 members in 36 of Japan's 47 prefectures. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and its entry into World War II was a terrible humiliation for the nation. The millions of soldiers who died, the two atomic bombings, and the Soviet invasion overwhelmed Japan, which had to capitulate on September 2, 1945. This defeat marked the beginning of the American occupation. Under the occupation, the Japanese people lacked everything, especially food. Paradoxically, citizens were able to count on the help of the Yakuza. The emergence of the black market enabled the Japanese people to feed themselves as best they could. Deeply attached to their homeland, the Yakuza even went so far as to trade their weapons for tools to help rebuild the country. This aid allowed the Yakuza to be better accepted in society, as Japanese citizens now felt indebted to them. However, in the late 1940s, the American occupying forces hinted they wanted to eliminate the Yakuza, a rather contradictory stance given that they had helped Japanese gangs during the occupation, especially in supplying rice for the black market. In reality, American policy during the occupation was quite disastrous. The American authorities, mainly General MacArthur, knew very well that gangsters were kings in Japan, but did nothing to restore order. Their priority was not the Yakuza, but the possible rise of communism. For this reason, the Americans saw the Japanese ultra-nationalist underworld as a potential ally, since they too were fiercely opposed to communism. This marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period that would bring to light another Japanese ultra-nationalist figure, Yoshio Kodama. He was one of the most powerful men in post-war Japan and one who would greatly mark the history of the Yakuza. Like Toyama before him, Kodama created alliances between gangsters and politicians. In 1933, he founded his own political group, the Independent Youth Society, whose main purpose was to assassinate certain Japanese politicians. After World War II, he was imprisoned in Tokyo and considered a Class A war criminal. Upon his release from prison on December 24, 1948, Kodama used his fortune, acquired through smuggling operations, for political purposes. He suppressed social conflicts and chased communists from Japan, much like Senator McCarthy did in the United States. To achieve his ends, Kodama even worked hand-in-hand with American intelligence services, the CIA, beginning a long cooperation. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA secretly funded Japanese nationalists to fight communism in Asia. The Yakuza, as allies of far-right politicians, benefited indirectly from this aid. Millions of dollars were paid by the CIA to support Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, the country's conservative right. Thanks to Kodama's influence, The Yakuza played a key role in the Japanese political scene after the war. The alliance with ultra-nationalist politicians allowed the underworld to become more influential than ever. Ultimately, the American occupation was a real boon for the Yakuza, who were able to develop politically and economically throughout the country. The 1950s marked a time of significant change for the Japanese. The country gradually regained its industrial power and recovered from the chaos of World War II. The San Francisco Peace Treaty in April 1952 marked the official end of the American occupation, allowing the Japanese nation to recover its sovereignty. By 1968, Japan had become the third largest economic power in the world. This rapid reconstruction did not make the Yakuza happy, as they had drawn large profits from the black market. As food became abundant again, this market disappeared, and they lost the control they had over the people. Japanese gangsters were thus forced to turn to other businesses, such as prostitution, gambling, entertainment, and especially drug trafficking. During World War II, the Japanese army had offered its soldiers methamphetamine to prevent fear and fatigue. After the war, huge stocks of the drug remained, and the Yakuza saw an opportunity, distributing it all over Japan, which allowed them to prosper. In addition to these activities, the Yakuza continued extortion, which was one of their main sources of income in the 1950s. Through their various activities, Japanese gangs grew substantially, generating prodigious income. It was also during the 1950s that the Yakuza began to copy the styles of American gangsters, influenced by the emergence of Hollywood cinema in Japan. Gangsters now dressed in dark suits, dark ties, and white shirts, usually accompanied by sunglasses. Some Yakuza bosses also changed their choice of car, preferring large American sedans. The number of Yakuza gangs increased considerably during this time. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police estimated that in 1958 there were around 70,000 Yakuza in Japan. 5 years later, this number climbed to 184,000 members, more men than the entire Japanese army at the time. In the 60s and 70s, two Yakuza families prospered: the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Kobe Syndicate, and the Inagawa-kai, located in the Tokyo area. The Inagawa-kai was founded by Kakuji Inagawa, another influential Yakuza leader like Kazuo Taoka. Speaking of Taoka, his influence began to spread throughout the nation in the late 1950s, with nearly 10,000 kobun in his pay and a criminal organization with 343 different gangs. It was during this period that the two Yakuza leaders, Taoka and Inagawa, were about to declare war. However, on the contrary, they joined forces on October 24, 1972, thanks to a very close friend of both men, the gangster and politician Yoshio Kodama. As the most prominent figure in Japanese organized crime in the 1960s, he continued to do what he did best: combine the underworld and politics. These agreements further modernized the Yakuza gangs. Kodama was the political representative for some of the biggest Yakuza syndicates in the country, guaranteeing them access to the peak of political power. Kodama held politicians in one hand and an army of gangsters in the other. It's no exaggeration to say that in the 1960s and 70s, he was one of the most powerful men in Japan. At the end of the 1970s, an event put an end to Yoshio Kodama's career: charges of tax evasion linked to a huge scandal. The story began in 1957, when the representative of the American aerospace firm Lockheed in Japan was instructed to sell combat aircraft to the Japanese army. To do this, He made direct contact with Kodama, who used his political connections to favor the American company in exchange for huge bribes. The affair broke in 1976, and the Japanese people were indignant. Kodama's long descent into hell began. He was tried and accused of having embezzled $6.5 million in income taxes between 1972 and 1975, and of having illegally obtained $3.6 million in foreign currency. Throughout his trial, demonstrators came to his home, intent on making him pay for his betrayal. Supporters of ultra-nationalist groups, once great admirers of Kodama, now suggested that he commit suicide to atone for soiling Japan's honor, even encouraging him to perform the famous harakiri, ritual suicide by disembowelment. The phenomenon grew to such proportions that one day a man named Mitsuyasu Maino, an ex-film actor and ultra-nationalist partisan, tried to kill Kodama by crashing a plane into his home like a World War II kamikaze pilot. The attack failed, as he narrowly missed his target and died instantly in the crash. Following this scandal, Yoshio Kodama's health rapidly declined, and his empire with it. Kodama told reporters he had received divine punishment for serving an American airline that killed so many Japanese during the Pacific War. He died in his sleep of a stroke on January 17, 1984, in Tokyo before the end of his trial. This large-scale scandal greatly tarnished the image of the Yakuza in the eyes of the Japanese people. This bad publicity was not enough to reduce the power of the Japanese underworld. Kazuo Taoka, the leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi, now 65, was still as influential as ever, with nearly 120,000 Yakuza in his ranks. Unlike Kodama, he knew he had to stay in the shadows, but he too would fall from his pedestal due to gang rivalry. One evening in July 1978, Taoka was sitting in a Kyoto nightclub with 5 henchmen when a young man in a white shirt stood up, pulled out a .38 caliber pistol, and emptied his magazine at the underworld godfather. The assailant fled while Taoka was rushed into an armored Cadillac and taken under police escort to the nearest hospital. Hit in the neck, he miraculously survived. Taoka's attacker was a 25-year-old Yakuza belonging to the Matsuda Gumi clan, a rival of the Yamaguchi Gumi. He was found a few weeks later, savagely murdered on the side of a mountain near Kobe. After this assassination attempt, a gang war worthy of 1930s Chicago broke out. Yakuza clashed in broad daylight, and not even law enforcement could stop the chaos. 5 other Yakuza affiliated with the Matsuda Gumi were assassinated in the bloody reprisals that followed. Meanwhile, Taoka struggled to recover. His injuries had weakened him considerably, forcing him to retire for some time. It was the beginning of the end for the clan godfather. The Yamaguchi Gumi syndicate owed much of its strength to Taoka's leadership, but after the attempt on his life, things were no longer the same. Increasingly weak, Taoka lost control of his gang, and the clan began to divide as some lieutenants fought to become his heir. Taoka finally died of a heart attack in July 1981, ending his 35-year reign over Japan's most powerful Yakuza syndicate. At the time of his death, the Yamaguchi Gumi clan was generating more than $460 million a year. To everyone's surprise, his wife, Fumiko Taoka, took over the reins of the Yamaguchi Gumi, something unprecedented in Yakuza history. Fumiko's role was intended to be temporary, to fill the void until a male leader could emerge. It was not until 1984 that a new godfather, Masahisa Takanaka, was elected. In 1980s Japan, the Yamaguchi Gumi and the Inagawa Kai were still the 2 prominent Yakuza families. But there was another, the Sumiyoshi Kai. This syndicate was unique in that it had no single oyabun. Instead, it had several heads, all equal to each other. The tribute paid by Kobun was lower, and more autonomy was given to gang members. This system worked well, as the Sumiyoshi Kai brought in more than $276 million a year in the mid-1980s. What were the police doing all this time? They were cooperating with the gangsters. There has always been a unique relationship between law enforcement and the Yakuza, with widespread and institutionalized corruption. When police organized raids, gangsters were often warned beforehand, giving them plenty of time to flee and hide incriminating evidence. The Yakuza were sometimes nice enough to leave some guns behind for the police to save face. There was also a certain familiarity between them, as gangsters and police usually knew each other by name and shared the same conservative and nationalist values. One Japanese policeman said, "Not all Yakuza are bad. I have friends who are Yakuza. They are honorable, chivalrous people. They show the true spirit of the Japanese people." The gangsters, in turn, respected the police and understood their duty to uphold the law. For example, after a murder was committed, the guilty Yakuza would often go to the nearest police station to make a full confession. Yakuza leader Kakuji Inagawa said, "We believe in the Japanese police. If they say the Yanagawa gang is bad, then it is so. I don't want to say this, but they are very capable. It is their duty to watch me. I respect them. Please convey my best regards to them." This complicity was such that some Yakuza would help the police resolve certain conflicts within Japanese society. The late 1980s were a wonderful time for Japan, as the economy experienced extraordinary growth from 1986 to 1990, with real estate and stock market values exploding. Tokyo became the largest stock exchange in the world. This economic boom did not escape the Yakuza. They dove into the real estate and stock markets, investing big and reaping huge profits. Their illegal income from gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking also increased. It was a blessed period for the Japanese underworld, which amassed tens of millions of dollars thanks to this speculative bubble. This era was defined by Susumu Ishii, the new Yakuza godfather of Tokyo, who succeeded Kakuji Inagawa as the head of the Inagawa Kai. At that time, he was the richest gangster in all of Japan and one of the richest in the world. Unlike other Yakuza who flaunted their tattoos, Ishii adopted a more low-key and elegant lifestyle, preferring the strength of words to that of fists. This strategy succeeded, and by 1988, his fortune exceeded $1.6 billion. Everything he touched turned to gold. During his reign, the Inagawa Kai became Tokyo's largest crime syndicate, with nearly 7,500 men at his disposal. In just 3 years, he had raised the Yakuza to heights they had never reached before. But all bubbles eventually burst, and the Japanese economy was no exception. The crisis began in the early 1990s and was one of the worst in the country's history. Ishii's empire collapsed, and to make matters worse, his health seriously deteriorated. In October 1990, he resigned as head of the Inagawa Kai and officially retired. He died almost a year later. After years of prosperity, it was time for Japan to pay the piper. The Yakuza saw their income drop drastically, and a decade of scandals ensued, linking the underworld to bad loans totaling $288 billion during the speculative bubble. The economic crisis reflected the failure of law enforcement to contain the Yakuza's influence. In response, senior Japanese police officials concluded that stricter measures were necessary. On March 1, 1992, the Japanese government passed an anti-gang law designating the Yakuza as a social evil for the first time. The Yakuza didn't sit idly by. They organized demonstrations and filed several lawsuits. At first, the law seemed to have a huge impact, with police announcing that thousands of gangsters had ceased their activities. But this was far from reality. The law had driven out tens of thousands of gangsters, but most of them simply became associates to be cleared of suspicion. Ultimately, the law only had the effect of driving the Yakuza further underground, making intelligence gathering even more difficult. This crackdown had another, more important consequence. The Yakuza began to explore business opportunities overseas. With their income from gambling and extortion having fallen sharply, they needed new markets. In the early 1990s, they embarked on the international trafficking of women. They lured tens of thousands of women from across Asia with promises of legitimate jobs. But in reality, these women were drugged and exploited as sex slaves in Japanese brothels. This was a profitable business, bringing in billions of dollars every year. Another, even more lucrative market was overseas drug trafficking. They traded internationally in methamphetamine, usually produced in East Asia, reaping huge profits. They also became interested in heroin from Southeast Asia and cocaine. In the 1990s, representatives of the Colombian Cali cartel reportedly contacted the Yamaguchi-gumi to plot bringing huge quantities of cocaine into Japan. This alliance gave international criminal authorities nightmares. The Colombian cartel sent cocaine distributors across Japan, but strangely, the threatened cocaine blizzard never happened, and the Colombians never followed through on the case. The Yakuza also dealt with the Russian Mafia. A fruitful collaboration developed, allowing for the resale of stolen cars and consumer goods from Japan to Russia, and in exchange, Russian weapons and women came to Japan. The most ambitious Yakuza had already set their sights on the United States long ago. In the early 1970s, they began to appear in Hawaii and on the American mainland, establishing bases in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. In the early 1980s, New York police became aware of Yakuza operations, but were not overly concerned. They believed the 5 Mafia families would control any rackets. Less than a year later, they learned that the New York Mafia had decided to collaborate with the Yakuza, particularly in organizing clandestine gambling. In the eyes of the American Mafia, the Yakuza were not a threat, but a way to expand their business. This deal benefited both parties. By the end of the 20th century, the Yakuza had established themselves in a plethora of countries, allowing them to considerably develop their activities internationally. As they entered the second millennium, the Yakuza faced new, more insidious problems. Kakuji Inagawa expressed fear for the future. The Yakuza must respect morals and regulations and obey them, but that tradition is fading. It is because of the generation gap that I worry. The most common complaint among underworld bosses in the 2000s was that the new Yakuza were more violent, less obedient, and more interested in big profits than old traditions. Tokutaro Takayama, a longtime leader of a Kyoto Yakuza gang, told a reporter, "Today they don't care anymore about obligations, tradition, respect, and dignity. There are no rules anymore." The modern Yakuza has gradually shed the weight of tradition to look more like an ordinary gangster. The criminal world of the 21st century no longer needs ideology, chivalry, or absolute loyalty. On the contrary, this era seems to demand that thugs be more deceitful, cunning, and without honor. For the first time in their history, the Yakuza began to act only for themselves and no longer for the gang as a whole. This modernization of Yakuza gangs began in the rubble of 1945 and continues today. During this time, the Japanese underworld gradually abandoned its principles, and gang wars that caused many civilian casualties are one example among many. In 1984, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, who know the Yakuza better than anyone, went public with what they had been observing for years. There's a clear trend of declining solidarity and obedience among the Yakuza members. This stems from the retirement of aging gang bosses who maintain strict discipline, as well as changes in the temperament of rank-and-file gangsters. This decline is also explained by the rise of younger oyabun, who have gradually changed the structure of gangs. The older generation and its traditions have gradually disappeared. Not all younger generation Yakuza are misfits. They are simply the fruit of another generation, less receptive to ancient customs and seeing them only as obstacles to their activities. Like the fall of Omerta in the Italian Mafia, some Yakuza began to speak out and inform on their bosses, an act that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Accumulating great wealth or succeeding in business became the only goal of the new generation of Japanese gangsters. The Yakuza are far from ordinary gangsters. Present since feudal Japan, they became a key part of the country's political power in the 20th century. Throughout their history, they have played the role of an honorable opposition in Japanese society, sometimes accepted, sometimes rejected, sometimes criminals, sometimes heroes. Over the decades, the Japanese have learned to live with the underworld, sometimes yielding to its demands to maintain a semblance of social peace. In the past, this method made it possible to ensure a certain harmony within the population, but this social contract is in the process of being broken. Strongly weakened, the Yakuza are now on the verge of extinction. Their numbers have dropped drastically, as has the number of young Japanese joining their ranks. Authorities are now doing everything they can to fight against their misdeeds and even offer them reintegration into society. A strange fate for this criminal group that was once king in the land of the rising sun. So from feudal outcasts to the shadowy kings of Japan's underworld, the story of the Yakuza is a story of contradictions. They were heroes and villains, criminals with a code, and a shadow government that operated in plain sight. For centuries, they were an undeniable and sometimes even accepted part of Japanese society. But the world changed, and so did they. The traditions of loyalty and honor that once gave them their identity have eroded, replaced by the simple pursuit of profit. And in losing their code, they began to lose their power. The Yakuza, once more powerful than an army, are now fading into history, a strange and complex chapter in the story of Japan. The question that remains is not just what their legacy will be, but what will rise to take their place. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the Yakuza. If you want more content like this, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It really helps the channel grow. Take care. and we'll see you in the next one.